What is shaking, and welcome to another round of MTGA tasting notes. Today we're diving into the flagship, what MTGA is all about, what we started with, what we're continuing with, and that is our Merlot. And this will be the 2019 iteration of it. Just released in the fall of 2022. This is something that it's always a fun time of year because we get into a few new wines between Pinot Noir, Merlot, and Cabernet. We also have tasting note videos on both of those other two wines as well for you to dive into. But I love talking about the Merlot in particular because it is just so near and dear to my heart. It's what we started with 13 seasons ago. We wrapped up our 13th harvest this year. So it's something that always kind of brings me back, and it makes me think about all those past seasons, what was similar, what was different, how we acted or reacted to go from grape to bottle and continue with Merlot as being our flagship. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this bad boy. Now, as is tradition, it is 100% Merlot. As the way it's been in its entire history. It's 100% Merlot from just outside the town of St. Helena out towards Zinfandel Lane, as well as off of Pope Street, just a little bit outside of downtown St. Helena proper. In more recent years, we focused a little bit more on that Pope Street property. That Zinfandel Lane property actually got replanted to Cabernet Sauvignon. And that is something that we are now using today as well. That was actually the first vineyard that I ended up sourcing from, and we'll be getting into that wine in the coming years once that gets released. But another story for another time. From this Pope Street vineyard, it is something that has just been rockstar for us. It has been, there's a reason why it's been a staple. And this Merlot property has really just sung. And it's, if you know the St. Helena area and kind of how these wines present themselves, they tend to be very fruit driven. They tend to have a really nice kind of subtle structure to them, which is, I think, perfect for Merlot. It really leans into that varietal character. It doesn't make it too edgy, too big, too bold. Really, and in the same regard, I guess, or on the opposite side of things, it doesn't make it too light or flabby and just kind of like nondescript red wine. It kind of really just helps lean into what great Merlot has to offer. And I think that's right what you get from the nose on this thing. The red fruit characteristics, because we do tend to harvest a little bit early, definitely jump out of the glass at you. Sometimes it does lean a little bit more towards like that black cherry, blackberry kind of thing, but we're not talking about like your, really jammy kind of characteristics. I almost think if you've ever had like just a freshly ripe blackberry, sorry, that's a little geeky, but if you pluck a blackberry that's still got a little bit of nice tartness to it, but it's got that nice fruitiness to it, that's exactly what this Merlot typically has. Year in and year out, and this 2019 is no different. Now, because Merlot can be so plush and so easygoing, the biggest problem with it is that it's tough to make interesting. And this is something that I've probably said in almost all of my tasting notes for Merlot in particular, is that you have to find ways to get Merlot to reach out and grab you. And that's a big reason why we do harvest a little earlier. It keeps the acidity a little bit higher. It adds a little bit extra backbone to the wine. It really focuses on those red fruit characteristics rather than those dark fruit characteristics, which is just kind of my own niche of where I love Merlot to play. And from there, it's just a matter of picking the right barrel selection, dialing that aging time, when to bottle it, any bottle aging time, and there you have it. That's kind of our quote-unquote recipe, although there's always a little bit of wiggle room with every vintage. For 2019, this was aged 22 months in about 30% new French oak barrels, so fairly light-handed on the French oak side of things. Then another year in bottle after that. So it's close to, 34 months, basically door to door, to get this from a grape to the bottle that is in front of you here. It's a long process, probably something that's a little bit longer than many, Merlot producers out there. Typically you think of probably your bigger Cabernets or red blends having that 3-year aging time, but I really find that for our Merlot, it really helps it sing. And what I really love about this wine is the weight of it. It has this really it kind of jumps out of the gate at you. This Merlot and actually our Pinot Noir are very similar in that sense that they really kind of, there's this big pop of flavor, especially when they're young. And it kind of is like, oh, okay, wow, it's there. And then it kind of like blossoms and then it just smooths right out on the finish. This definitely leans a little bit more towards like almost like I almost get like that strawberry, like rhubarb pie kind of vibe from it. Like it's not as tart, I would say, but it still has that like almost refreshing kind of quality to it. I wouldn't say it has any like of those, like any herbal or pyrazine kind of characteristics that can come along with some of these Bordeaux varietals or potentially an earlier harvest. But it's almost a little bit more savory, like almost think of like a really, really solid like Kalamata olive kind of thing going on. It's like, that's kind of like way in the background. Something that's kind of just hanging out back there, just like a nice little added layer of complexity to it. I've also been eating a lot of olives recently, so weird. It's probably just my own head and how I'm feeling about it right now. Because I don't think I've ever described that in our wines previously. But even after a few swirls, letting it aerate, really letting it kind of settle down, it just continues to fill out. And it gets a little richer, a little rounder on that second sip. And this is something that I preach whenever you're tasting a wine, especially if you're trying to evaluate a wine. If you're just kind of crushing wine, with a group of friends, or you're just kind of having, a glass of wine to take the edge off and you're not really trying to think too much about it, you don't necessarily need to do this. But I always try to take at least 3 sips of a wine before I really start kind of evaluating it, quote unquote. The first one is always a little bit of a shock to the system because you're still tasting what you had previously. Maybe it's a wine that you had before in a wine tasting, or maybe it's something you had for lunch, or maybe it's your coffee after dinner and you're kind of finishing up that last little bit of wine that you have in your glass. That flavor of that wine is going to change pretty dramatically. And since we just tapped into this bottle to see it, it's still a little tight, still needs a little bit of air time, but a few swirls in the glass knocks that right out. And by the third sip, it's got this just really nice richness to it. It almost has like a slightly, like a fresh, like fig. Because fig, you almost think of like fig jam and things where it's like sweet and really jammy. But think of like a fresh fig off the tree where it's a little bit like, maybe like crisper, cleaner, and a little bit lighter. It's not, kind of concentrated like a jam would be. It's just got this really nice kind of lively thing going on. And that's that acidity that we're talking about. It kind of keeps it a little fresher, a little bit brighter, a little bit easier going. And that's something that I try to maintain in all of our red wines, is I want that acidity to be a little bit higher probably than on average to help give it kind of that refreshing, kind of mouth-watering, kind of characteristic to it. I mean, this is a baby of a Merlot. I would say the 2019 compared to some of our other vintages, the way it's tasting right now, this wine is one of the bigger and bolder iterations of it. It's not something that I think is overly intense, but there's a lot of structure there. There's actually a lot more tannin than I would say is typical of some vintages. Some vintages, it tends to be a little softer, a little bit more rounded. This one definitely reaches out and grabs you a little bit more. Nothing wrong with that, just kind of that vintage variation that we have with it. I think the same thing happened with 2018, but it was more so the barrel tannin, like kind of that oak tannin really got absorbed, and for whatever reason, the barrels really took hold of that 2018 vintage, but the fruit characteristics help balance that out quite a bit. This one, the oak is a little less prominent. There's still some of that nice kind of spice to the wine, those baking spices, the things that actually Brittany, the glorious HBIC, really loves about the Merlot in particular. Those are there, but they're masked a little bit right now by some of the other flavors and some of the structure. But if you are patient enough to hang on to this wine, even over the next 3, 6, months or so from whenever you purchase it, it will open up a little bit more, gain a little bit more character and complexity, and only get better with time. Realistically, we've seen that with our Merlot across the board. We're going back to even the 2011 and the 2010 vintage, our first couple of vintage. Those wines are still tasting amazing and continuing to evolve into the future. So this 2019 release is still very much a baby. It's got plenty of life left in it. It's something that you can easily tap into now and enjoy as you see fit, or feel free to hang on to it and see how it evolves over time. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you get a chance to try this wine. Of course, if you need to schedule a tasting with us, feel free to hit us up on our website. That's mtgawines.com. There's a little form at the bottom. You can just shoot us an email. We'll get a tasting all scheduled for you. Do stay in touch on our newsletter as well. You can sign up for that on our newsletter, on our website as well, for any events going around the country, any new releases, all that good stuff. So as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of the day, and stay tuned for more tasting notes and cellar updates from our MTGA channel here. Cheers.